understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? Podcast time. We are going to talk about the United States, not least because the United States is looming large in everybody's timeline, on the news, etc. And the United States is still the most important economy in the world, and particularly for countries like Ireland, who have kind of hitched their wagon to the United States in trade or investment or capital flows. What happens to the United States? I know it's a cliche, but if the Americans sneeze, the rest of the world, particularly small countries like Ireland, and it's fair to say other European countries, catch a cold. Now,
not if you get vaccinated.
Well, listen. At least you still believe in vaccines, John. The amount of people I've actually met who've gone anti-vax over the last while.
I know. I mean, actually, that's a good point. Yeah.
It's really bizarre. It's really bizarre, and there's a suite of beliefs. Anti-vax, Putin's a good guy, Donald Trump is fine, Bitcoin's one. It's like, do you remember the Venn diagram you used to do for maths in the junior cert?
Yeah.
That Venn diagram, you've got it all going on. But we can talk about that in another podcast. This time, I want to talk about the fact we talked about the Fed last week, cutting interest rates, inflating yet again what looks to be a bubble. It's just the idea that what the Fed is always doing is trying to make sure that stock markets continue to rise, right?
Yeah.
Now, the downside of that...
It's just this kind of really fine balancing act that Jerome Powell is doing constantly.
Well, the downside of that is if you're continuing to boost valuations of equities, right, of stocks, the owners of capital do very well, right? And the other hand, what they call about the distributional effects of this. How is this distributed around the economy, this wealth effect? And it seems to me that it's distributed probably, well, it's not just me. We all know that there's massively unequal distribution of the upside of all this wealth.
Yes.
So after all this, it's probably, we know we can talk to the cheerleaders and we talk to the rah-rah people who says everything's going to be fine. But I suspect it's time to be a little bit skeptical, John. A little bit skeptical, right? And with that in mind, we're going to go and talk to an arch skeptic, a short seller. These are the people who go against the grain. Jim Chanos was the man who shorted Enron all those years ago. When everyone was saying Enron was the greatest thing since sliced bread, he looked at the numbers, he said, no, there is a fraud going on deep inside this. And that's where he made his name. So this is a guy who can actually see beyond the hype, see through the numbers, and actually look at balance sheets. But also, it's not just balance sheets. You're getting a fairly good handle on culture, on society, on the vibe. When everybody is saying everything's hunky-dory and they're all over here, it takes a brave man to say, you know what? I don't believe it. So let's go to New York and talk to Jim. Jim, good to see you there. I haven't seen you in a while.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me.
Jim, let's get straight into it. What do you think is going on macro-wise in the world?
So here we are at the end of August in 2024. We are about 2 months and a little bit more from our election, which has people fixated here in the States. The Fed has just finished its Jackson Hole meeting, where Powell has indicated beyond any shadow of doubt anymore that the Fed has turned accommodative or dovish. And there were fears really of a slowing economy throughout this year in the U.S. Now, while I think things have come off the boil, I don't think in any way, shape, or form yet the U.S. economy is near a recession. And you have a few dichotomies that are kind of glaring right now. You have a bond market in the U.S. that is if not rooting for a slowdown, seems to think that a slowdown is going to continue and inflation will come down with it. And you have a stock market that is hitting all-time highs and where the estimates for S&P 500 earnings growth are as robust as they've ever been. We're looking for basically 15 to 20% growth in S&P earnings at the second half of this year, and then another good 12 or so percent next year. Those are not recessionary numbers, David. So the stock market thinks that it's all green lights. The bond market thinks it's green and what we would call yellow alternating. And one of them is probably going to be dead wrong. Now, the big monkey wrench is the election.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah. You couldn't get two candidates who are more opposite ends of the spectrum in a political economic sense. Obviously, the president will need a Congress to enact anything major. And right now, the best bet is that the Congress will be split again between the Democrats and the Republicans. Democrats are odds on to take the House, and the Republicans are odds on to take the Senate. So you'll have a divided legislature, which is going to be a tough place to pass anything meaningful. The president has increasing powers, as you know, under executive orders and through regulation, but it's a pretty stark choice between Harris and Trump.
And let's talk about, if we can, I mean, I know it's very strange, the economics of either candidate or both candidates. Harris seems to be thinking out loud now. She's formulating her policies. They're coming in a drib drab, but it's beginning to look like something. Trump, on the other hand, tell me Trumponomics. Explain to me, for the Society for Markets. Are you just giggling there?
I don't know how to explain the narcissistic economics. Is that a branch of the dismal science? I don't know. I mean, part of the problem, certainly people like me and others have with Trump, is that we really kind of don't know. He doesn't have deep held political philosophies or economic philosophies. And so, he's at some point kind of echoed orthodox Republican policies. And at other times he says things that are just kind of out of left field for either party. I will say this. I mean, he governed the first go around pretty much on an orthodox Republican platform of policies, tax cuts for the wealthy, less regulation. So I suspect that it would be more of the same. But, his embracing of RFK Jr. and others just, sometimes makes you scratch your head as to what he really believes. Harris is a much more left of center, political economic orthodoxy. There was a lot of a concern last week that she was going to embrace the Biden budget proposals, which include a tax on unrealized gains. And I think that's just absolutely not going to happen. It'll never pass Congress, not least because the ability to value private businesses would make it completely unworkable. So some of the more left-leaning policies that Harris apparently may embrace, and we don't have a full economic policy statement from her yet on her website or from her directly. So a lot of this is from sources in the campaign and what have you. And we'll see. I would suspect that within the next week or two, you're going to see a much more comprehensive set of policy proposals from the Harris camp. Right now they haven't had to, having been the candidate for only 5 weeks. But I suspect that honeymoon will end pretty quickly.
Now, Jim, you've made your name over 45 years of investing by identifying, you've spoken about the golden age of fraud, but identifying something that's sort of a hot air, a bubble, an effervescence, all that sort of stuff, and saying, hold on a second. When I look at the numbers, what I'm seeing is a different story. Can you apply that sometimes to politics? Do you ever think in your own way about politics and the way in which, political individuals and parties frame themselves?
Yeah, I think it's all woven together. I'm a big believer in the concept of political economy. Economics, as you know better than anyone, is not a hard science. It's a social science.
Sure.
So, that if you put sodium and chloride together in the same combination every single time, you're going to get salt. But people act differently with different incentives and stimuli. And so we best can guess behavior and can guess about cause and effect, but there's no givens in economics. And politics is the overriding determinant in some of these types of policies. So the problem we have, I think, one of the reasons I've dubbed this the golden age of fraud, is that, we are willing as a society generally in the West to just put up with a lot more bullshit, for lack of a better term, than we ever have.
Very descriptive term.
Yeah, there's a difference between outright lies and bullshit. And The problem is the edges begin to blur over time, and we accept more and more things that just aren't true with a shrug and, oh, well, that's just the way they are. That's the way he is or she is. And that really erodes things then once you start filtering it down to things like finance and commerce, where companies get away with more and more, and investors shrug and just say, well, that's the way we just do it. Just one specific example for the listeners is this complete absurd convention we have in the United States, particularly in technology, whereas if you pay your employees with stock rather than cash, it doesn't count as an expense. So you have companies that are losing hundreds of millions of dollars a year on a GAAP accounting and actual accounting basis, but because they pay their employees maybe 1/3 in equity or half in equity, they show that they're profitable. And that's just, in my way of thinking, accounting fraud. And yet the SEC does nothing. They just shrug, and despite a warning a number of years ago about pro forma accounting, they've done nothing about it in over a decade. And so it's a slippery slope. We have CEOs who routinely lie literally almost every day, if you follow them on Twitter, and just come out and say the craziest things about their companies, and investors just shrug. And this would not have happened even in the era of Enron. I mean, people would have been aghast at this in 2000 or 2001. And that was at the height of the dot-com era, where there was a lot of craziness going on. But people went to jail for this. And today it's kind of an accepted practice. And so I think that when I say the golden age of fraud, I don't say it lightly.
Yeah, because it's a big observation, It's a big observation. You've got, like, last week we did a podcast with Andy Haldane, who is the former chief economist of the Bank of England. Very erudite guy, very, very thoughtful guy. And he spoke to me about the economics of trust. And what he was talking about was the centrality of trust in society, in any democracy in particular, where basically you're gambling that the guy next to you does the right thing, in effect. There's no authoritarian sort of message coming down from above. So we're all sort of like bottom up. And this can be seen in a variety of areas. He was talking about the riots in the UK and all that sort of stuff, right? But what you're talking about, again, is the same idea. It's a breakdown of trust, where trust is sort of abused and besmirched and therefore undermined. And then it becomes normal.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at even in the media. I mean, so we now have a view that despite the explosion of social media and your ability, this amazing technology to connect with anyone in the world with something, a device in your pocket, and to have all of the information pretty much in all of history literally at your disposal within seconds, we've become suspicious of any type of edited media, saying, oh, it's the mainstream media and it's therefore false, or it's all lies. And I have to rely on, the guy in his basement who's texting or putting social media up about some event that's simply false. And I think that's frightening. I think that we've become more siloed as opposed to more collaborative and cooperative. And as I'm sure Mr. Haldane probably would agree, there's externality costs to the concept of fraud and a lack of belief. And when you lose trust in certain institutions that we take as givens, which are sort of the lubricant for not only political discourse, but for political economy, we pay a price for that. And I think that's one of my big picture concerns, is that just has eroded dramatically in the last 25 years.
So Jim, when you actually step out from the States and you look around, so I see the price of gold is going up. So the gold bugs are back, and they're betting on a sort of slightly Armageddonist worldview, and they're looking at politics, and they're saying, hold on a second, and they're looking at the Fed, and the Fed is now, as you said, it's always accommodative. It's always trying to keep the show on the road. What are your major concerns when you look at it, that really big picture? Because I know that you're a big thinker. Yeah, you identify companies, but that seems to me always to be the funneled through a perception of where the world is going.
Yeah. So I always tell the story of that in 1979, David, I was working every summer in a steel mill to pay my university costs. And I had to join a union. And we made tubular steel, and I made more in my last summer in 2 months than I made in my first full year on Wall Street in 1980. I was earning $14 an hour as a union employee in 1979, And I was working as many hours as my fellow workers would give me because they all had lake houses in Wisconsin and boats and basically supported their family on one salary. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but 1979 and 1980 was a watershed. You had Thatcher elected in the UK, you had Reagan elected in the US, and the grand pendulum of sort of capital and labor, which had by 1979 shifted pretty dramatically in terms of real high nominal GDP growth, higher inflation, high wages, and high real wages, was about to change. And capital, which, quite frankly, from 1929 to 1979 was treated pretty badly in real terms. You made some money, but you didn't make anything like the money you were about to make in the next 45 years. And with the election of Thatcher and Reagan, it all changed, I think. What did Thatcher do? She went after the unions. Reagan did the same thing. You had Volcker coming in 1979 at the Fed, who absolutely committed to crushing inflation and over the short-term real growth. And capital, when I got on Wall Street in 1980, nobody wanted to work there. I mean, nobody wanted to work there.
That's so funny because it was regarded when I left college, as, wow, my God, you hit the jackpot if you went to work with one of these places. That was in the mid, so the early 90s.
Yeah, by the 90s that had changed. So clearly, the bottom was 82. But it was, I remember in one of my interviews in 1980, someone just said, why do you want to come here? I mean, we're not doing anything. It's an investment bank. And so that, of course, now is completely turned on its head. And for 45 years now, we've had capital ascended over labor. We've had no inflation, and we've had relatively austere fiscal policies relative to the past. And that may have all changed in 2021. We'll see. But now we have governments that are clearly running higher deficits and paying no political price to do so, at least not yet. We saw a resurgence of inflation that we hadn't seen in almost 50 years. You have political parties that used to be fiscally conservative that are now just as profligate as liberal parties. I mean, we'll see if labor pressure on minimum wages at the low end of the wage scale for the first time upward. We'll see if there's been a change in this tug of war between capital and labor that occurred because of COVID and has continued since. You have less globalization, arguably, more onshoring of manufacturing as opposed to offshoring of manufacturing. You have the willingness to accept tariffs. I mean, that's all, again, relatively new. That's stuff we saw, pre-1979. And a lot of that is now back. And so from a big macro picture, if there was one macro thing that I would say investors need to know is what side of that pendulum are we on? Is capital being advantaged by policymakers and citizens, or is labor being advantaged? And as I said, something may have changed a couple of years ago. We'll see.
Well, it's fascinating you think that, because that comes back to this big idea that economics, actually the world, moves in these large, almost generational, multi-decade super cycles. And then the pendulum moves gradually, and within every big ideology is the seeds of its own destruction, because typically it goes a little bit too far. So now you have the United States. If you listen to the hustings, if you listen to Kamala Harris and you listen to Donald Trump, both of them are appealing to the average guy. Now, whether Trump decides, if he gets in, to reward his mates, the billionaires who've basically backed him, I'm sure he will. But the rhetoric is the rhetoric of the 1930s. It's tariffs against China. It is a clampdown on immigration. It is a working man needs to get his common wage, etc. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Now, let's think, if the pendulum swings back
How about increased defense spending everywhere?
Well, absolutely. Hugely increased. You actually saw it. I even saw this morning in the Financial Times, the headline was, the share prices of defense companies gone through the roof in the last couple of years, actually, and particularly in the last couple of months. So you've got you're almost back to a Cold War détente idea where you know who your enemies are, which you didn't 10 years ago because you thought everyone was a friend. And it looks like maybe the 1960s into the 1970s again. Now, if it were that, what does that mean for American society? What does American society look like? Because it might not be too bad.
No, I mean, what everyone forgets is, again, we kind of stuck with narratives that play over and over in our heads. But having lived through the 60s and 70s, I can tell you that for all of the political excitement, if you will, for lack of a better term, that the 60s and 70s had, there was exceptional real growth in both decades. And while inflation overshadowed real GDP growth in the 70s as a narrative, the 70s were a pretty good time. And they were a really good time if you were a worker, not in finance. And so you had the advent of women in the workforce. So a lot of families became two-income families as opposed to one. But there were plenty of jobs for those women entering the workforce. And again, I mean, it was a time of relatively strong global real GDP growth. It just was on the back of finance. And finance was not the predominant factor that it is today in that economy. And so it just depends where you're standing. And I would agree with you that most parties, and certainly in the U.S., are now hewing a populist line. The difference, as we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, however, is that with Trump, you kind of really don't know, since he did the same thing in 2016 and then immediately just adopted a sort of standard Republican set of policies.
Yeah, it was almost like a Mitt Romney policy dressed up as a Donald Trump candidate, which is kind of bizarre.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. I remember saying about the 70s, sending John a YouTube video of Lynyrd Skynyrd Freebird at Oakland in 1977. And it was an image of the United States that we haven't seen, It was like, no, seriously, it was a totally different looking country, and it's a totally different feel in America.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, Jim, just about other countries, right? In the same way as companies can have great run-ups and can look really, really robust and muscular and ahead of the curve and everything's going right and revenue's coming in, countries can also do the same. Now, you look at Ireland, you're a regular visitor. I have a sort of a niggling feeling that Ireland has taken a massive, massive bet on America that we're just thinking may well be changing. Right? It's taken a big bet on Silicon Valley, but also on Wall Street. It has taken a massive bet on globalization. It has taken a massive bet on the world being open and free and no real enemies. It has taken a massive bet on defense spending being low and we can run along for the ride. It has also, as you know, taken a massive bet on inequality in the sense that the housing market is, in the same way as it is in Boston and New York and all around the states of California, way beyond the grasp of the average guy or girl.
You guys are not doing that again, are you?
Oh yeah. We're not doing it with a banking system. We're not doing it leveraging the bejesus out of everything, but we're doing it with supply side problems. We're also doing it with a massive boost to demand from immigration, all these sort of things. When you look at a country, can countries go bad quickly?
Well, we certainly know they can go bad quickly when they involve the banking system, to square that circle. So the problem when it becomes a little bit more structural and supply side, to use your term, is that the unwind, basically, if the free market does work and you get more boom and bust type behavior by countries, if you don't involve the banking system, it can take a long time to, play itself out. And I think we're seeing the same thing, for example, in the property market in the US. It is not a credit problem because everybody learned the lesson from the last war. So they didn't leverage up. A lot of empty office buildings in the US only have mortgage debt of 50% of original value. So the mortgages are getting paid. It's just the equity's been wiped out. And people haven't realized that yet. And I suspect it's the same in a lot of housing markets around the world, with maybe the exception of my friends in China. And I'm more concerned about the risks to equity type values in lots of countries like Ireland, like the US, as opposed to the banking system, which we saw in, of course, 05 to 08. There, once fear comes in, it manifests itself quickly through leverage and through the unwillingness of people at senior levels of credit to take any additional risk. So you get transmission that's much faster once it's a bank-led boom. Now, that doesn't say that valuations and things like property and equities, whatever, aren't as sky high. They're higher right now than they were in 2007.
Absolutely. So people listening to us will know that when the Irish market collapsed or began to collapse in 2007, Irish house prices are now beyond where they were in real terms. In real terms. So we're back there without the banking system.
Yeah. Same in the U.S. And equity values, of course, are higher, much higher than they are today than they were in 2007. They're back to almost where they were in the 99, 2000. So, each cycle is different. But in terms of price levels, you're right, David. I mean, in many asset classes globally, we're well through previous peaks in real terms.
And as probably the United States, one of the world's most famous short sellers, what does that tell you before we go?
That's a very low bar, David. There aren't many of us left.
Yeah, you are. You're definitely a dwindling. I mean, it's very hard to be a short seller when a central bank keeps printing money. That's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, it's after 45 years, you would have thought I would figure that out. Look, there's always something to do. I mean, we've been talking a lot of macro, and of course, where I've made my money historically is not macro, it's micro. But you do look for these big sort of broad things to, if nothing else, tell you where you might have a fertile hunting ground for silly things. And we've had these epic frauds that have been popping up along the way, along this sort of golden road of prosperity. And there's a lot more coming. I mean, you've had the crypto space, which literally was designed for fraud.
And that's back again.
Oh, yeah, of course it is. And you have a Wirecard, which was the Enron of the EU, just a handful of years ago. You've got this massive Silicon Valley accounting scam going on that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast. So there's a lot of sort of silly things going on out there that'll probably keep me busy for the next 5 to 10 years, I think.
Well, listen, what we'll do is we'll try get you over to Dublin or to Kilkenny in November, and we'll talk about the golden age of fraud and lots of other stuff.
I'll do my best to try to make it there.
Listen, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Guys, it's always my pleasure. Anytime. Have a great rest of your summer, and hopefully we'll see you in a few months.
So, Mac, it looks like we are back to the 70s.
Well, it looks like the pendulum is probably going to go back to the 70s. You're probably right. The 70s with China, that's the difference. It's the 70s with immigration, because there was no immigration in the 70s. It's the 70s with China, and it's the 70s where the United States is no longer the preeminent power. But the narrative is 70s-esque in terms of protectionism, in terms of big government, in terms of increased minimum wage, and the return of the trade unions.
Yeah, and also, Mac, what is really interesting is back to the 70s with social media. And it's, Jim was talking about trust, which I think is a really interesting follow-on from what Andy Haldane was talking about last week, how trust has fallen apart.
Well, I suppose, it's worthy, John, of a podcast. It's a series of podcasts. Can social, economic, political trust survive social media? That's a very fair podcast. And maybe we'll get people who are smarter than us to come on and maybe inform us about that, because it is a fascinating area. And in the next 8 weeks in the United States and in Ireland, because we're about to have an election too, you will see all sorts of messages which will undermine the central idea of some sort of truth, some sort of, this idea is you can have your facts, right? Yeah. My opinions are more important. Okay,
when people start talking about my truth, there's no such thing as my truth. It's my opinion.
I cannot stand this thing, my truth. Like, what the hell?
It's meaningless.
It's meaningless. Anyway, we'll talk to you next week.